I want you to take a second and just think about your phone for a minute.
It's probably, what, right within arm's reach. Or you're holding it right now.
Yeah, exactly. You
Huh.
might literally be listening to us on it at this very moment.
Yeah.
And now think about your car, too, especially if it's one of those newer models with the big screen on the dashboard sitting out in the driveway.
Right, the ones that are basically rolling computers at this point.
Totally. And finally, just think about your bank account.
Yeah.
These are the tools we use, every single day to navigate modern life,
Yeah.
right? We use them to talk to our families, to drive across town, just buy the food we need to survive.
They feel like the absolute bedrock of our freedom, really, our personal autonomy.
Right. And this is the core of what we're talking about today. What if those exact same tools, the ones that feel like they give you so much freedom and, convenience, were simultaneously being used to build an inescapable digital cage around you?
It is, it's a profoundly unsettling thought experiment, mostly because we're just so deeply conditioned to view our devices as utilities. Just harmless tools, yeah.
Exactly. We rarely, if ever, stop to consider the invisible architecture of observation that's hardwired into them right from the factory floor. We willingly carry these tracking beacons around.
We invite them into our bedrooms.
We do. We seamlessly integrate them into our most intimate daily routines, and we do all of this completely unaware of the vast, just continuous trail of data exhaust we're leaving behind.
Data exhaust. I like that term. It's so accurate.
Yeah, and more importantly, we rarely ask who is, vacuuming up that exhaust. How are they aggregating it, and what do they actually intend to do with it once they've mapped out our entire lives?
And that invisible architecture is exactly what we are tearing apart in today's deep dive. So our source material today is this massive, really eye-opening interview from the Redacted YouTube channel.
Oh, it's a fantastic interview. It really is. And it features Thomas Drake. And for those who might not know the name, Drake is, he's a decorated veteran of the Air Force and Navy. He's a former senior executive at the National Security Agency, the NSA. And really, he's one of the foundational, pioneering whistleblowers of the modern intelligence era.
He really set the stage for everything that came after him.
He did. And in this source, he lays out a timeline that takes us from the shadowy, frankly panicked halls of the NSA right after 9/11 all the way to the so-called flock cameras that are probably reading your license plate in your neighborhood right now.
Which is terrifying when you really break down how they work.
Completely.
Yeah.
Now, I should mention right at the top here, this source material touches on some highly politically charged themes, okay? It details how this surveillance net has targeted people across the entire political spectrum.
Right. Nobody is immune to it.
Exactly. The source talks about everyone from former Democratic Senator Ted Kennedy to former Representative Tulsi Gabbard, and even independent journalists who are facing, bank account freezes over their coverage of the Ukraine war.
Right. It spans the whole spectrum.
Yeah, so to be completely clear with you, the listener, we are not here to take a political side today. And we aren't, endorsing every single claim made in the interview as undeniable gospel. We are simply impartially unpacking the fascinating and honestly alarming timeline of government surveillance and data architecture exactly as it's presented in the text.
Because honestly, this machinery operates identically regardless of who happens to be sitting in the Oval Office at any given time.
Exactly.
The apparatus of mass surveillance, it just doesn't have a political affiliation. Once the tools of, turnkey tyranny are built and integrated into the fabric of society, they exist for whoever holds the levers of power.
Turnkey tyranny, that is such a heavy phrase. And the sheer scale of the information Drake provides in this interview is staggering.
It's one thing to vaguely assume, algorithms are tracking what shoes I look at on Instagram.
Right, we all know the shoe ads follow us around.
Yeah, but it's entirely another thing to hear a former senior NSA executive detail the exact meetings, the specific technological decisions, and the crazy legal gymnastics they use to fundamentally alter the concept of privacy in our lifetimes.
So, to understand how we got to this current era of AI-driven mass surveillance and predictive policing, we kind of have to start by looking backward, right?
We do. We have to understand what the rules actually used to be and exactly when those rules were broken.
So let's talk about the era that formed Thomas Drake's worldview. He describes his background as being deeply rooted in the analog era of the 1970s.
Yeah, he was coming of age during the Watergate scandal, the revelation of the Daniel Ellsberg Pentagon
And the
Papers.
church committee hearings, right?
Exactly, the Church Committee. And that part is absolutely crucial because in the mid-1970s, the Church Committee was this massive public congressional investigation that exposed horrifying abuses by the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA.
Like really bad stuff.
Oh, terrible. The public learned for the first time that these agencies had been spying on American citizens without warrants. They were infiltrating civil rights groups, targeting political enemies, just operating completely outside the bounds of the U.S. Constitution for decades.
And Drake calls this period his civic awakening. I mean, he's watching a sitting U.S. president resign in disgrace because he was caught engaging in criminal acts and using intelligence agencies against his domestic political rivals.
It leaves a mark, right? So Drake enters the military and the intelligence community hyper-aware of what happens when the government goes rogue.
Right. And he starts out as a cryptolinguist and a voice processing specialist. Now, I want to pause on that because it sounds like something straight out of a Tom Clancy novel. What does a cryptolinguist actually do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, a cryptolinguist is essentially a frontline intelligence gatherer. They're fluent in foreign languages, obviously, but they're also trained in the highly technical art of intercepting, decoding, and analyzing adversary communications.
So they're literally the ones listening in.
Exactly. Drake was physically flying on reconnaissance missions. He was wearing headsets, intercepting signals, and processing voice data in real time. He was doing the granular, really hard work of foreign intelligence.
But he emphasizes in the interview that during this entire period, the 80s and the 90s, the operational rules were crystal clear, right?
Crystal clear. The guardrails were firmly in place, and that was largely due to the reforms that were born out of those 1970s church committee scandals we just talked about.
Right. They had to establish a legal framework so the abuses of the 60s and 70s just wouldn't happen again. And the primary mechanism for that was the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA.
Passed during the Carter administration, yes. And under FISA, the intelligence community had a very specific, limited mandate: foreign intelligence.
Foreign being the key word there.
Absolutely. Drake emphasizes over and over that they were absolutely forbidden, and we're talking with severe criminal penalties attached from listening in on what was legally defined as a U.S. person.
And let's clarify that legal terminology, because a U.S. person isn't just someone who was born in America, right?
No, it's broader than that. It covers legal residents, green card holders, and crucially, it even applies to U.S. corporations.
Wow, okay. So whether you were sitting in your living room in Chicago or you were traveling on business in Tokyo, if you were a U.S. person, the NSA was legally barred from touching your communications.
Completely barred. Unless they had very narrow, highly specific, court-approved warrants based on actual probable cause. It was an incredibly hard line. You do not cross it.
It was the definitive boundary. And Drake makes this brilliant point in the source material that just shatters a very common historical myth we hear all the time.
Oh, the antiquity myth.
Right.
Yes.
We constantly hear this excuse from politicians and intelligence directors that the laws in the early 2000s were simply too antiquated for the internet age.
They always claim the digital world just moved too fast for these old analog laws drafted in the 1970s. It sounds plausible on the surface.
It does sound plausible, until Drake points out that FISA had actually been updated 785 times since it was created.
Which is just a staggering number of revisions.
I couldn't believe that when I read it, 785 times. That completely destroys the argument that they were working with some dusty, outdated piece of parchment, you know?
It really does. Think about the sheer administrative and legislative effort required to amend legal framework nearly 800 times. They were constantly adapting it to keep pace with changing technology.
Like what kind of technology?
Well, new fiber optic cables, new packet switching technologies, early cellular networks. The framework was actually highly adaptable.
So the barrier preventing domestic surveillance wasn't a technological barrier at all.
No, not at all. It was a legal and constitutional barrier. The moment a U.S. person was involved in a communication stream, the Fourth Amendment, the constitutional protection against unreasonable search and seizure that became the paramount consideration.
Okay, so we have this strict, highly regulated analog era paradigm. Everyone knows the rules. Everyone knows the penalties for breaking them. And then we hit the turning point.
The massive shift.
Yeah. Thomas Drake, after years of service, gets promoted to a senior executive position at the NSA. And Man, the universe just has a very dark sense of timing here.
It really does, because his very first day on the job in this new senior leadership role is exactly September 11, 2001. He was 44 years old.
I mean, you can scarcely imagine a more dramatic, chaotic, and traumatizing entry into a leadership role.
It's unfathomable. Drake says it bluntly in the interview. There is life before 9/11, and there is life after 9/11.
Yeah.
The visceral trauma of that day, the loss of nearly 3,000 lives, and the catastrophic, undeniable failure of the multi-billion-dollar intelligence community to prevent it. It created a seismic paradigm shift inside the government.
Panic set in. Absolute panic.
Total panic, because the warning signs were everywhere. The system was blinking red.
And the source notes that phrase, blinking red, was actually used in a memo by CIA Director George Tenet years before the attacks.
Exactly. The intelligence agencies had fragments of information. They had the puzzle pieces scattered on the table, but they utterly failed to connect the dots.
And the government's reaction to this failure, which was decided in the deepest, darkest secrecy imaginable, was to just completely abandon the FISA rules and throw the Fourth Amendment out the window.
Right. They initiated a highly classified program of what they euphemistically decided to call bulk collection.
Let's focus on that language for a second, because the phrasing is so incredibly deliberate. Bulk collection. It is a classic Orwellian euphemism, isn't it?
Oh, entirely. It's designed specifically to sanitize the reality of the action. They consciously avoided calling it mass surveillance or warrantless domestic spying.
Because those terms would trigger immediate constitutional alarms for anyone who remembered the Church Committee.
Exactly. Bulk collection sounds bureaucratic. It sounds benign, like a logistics company managing warehouse inventory or something.
Right. We're just collecting the bulk goods.
But the mechanical reality was that they decided to take the vast, awesome, globally focused power of the NSA and turn it inward. They pointed it directly at the American public.
To sweep up phone calls, text messages, internet traffic on a scale that had literally never been attempted in human history.
And the justification that Drake was given when he realized what was happening, it's just chilling.
Yeah, because within weeks of 9/11, he sees the architecture changing.
He does, and he confronts his supervisor, who happens to be the number 3 person at the entire NSA.
Wow, going right to the top.
He had to. He goes to the general counsel's office, too. He basically says, "What are we doing here? We are flagrantly violating the Constitution we swore to protect."
And what's the response he gets?
The response from leadership is, "You don't understand, Mr. Drake. We just need the data."
We just need the data. That's it. That's the excuse.
That's it. And when Drake suggests the logical alternative of, going to Congress to legally change the law, if the threat landscape has genuinely outpaced the Constitution, the general counsel tells him, if we do that, they are going to say no.
That right there is the pivotal psychological moment of the entire post-9/11 era.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's the explicit documented admission that the intelligence apparatus knew full well that what they were doing was illegal.
They knew the Democratic representatives of the public would reject it if asked, and they just decided to do it anyway in secret.
They blasted right through the constitutional guardrails because the internal mindset had become an obsessive compulsion. The mindset was, we missed the 9/11 hijackers, we failed to protect the country, so to make sure we never miss anything ever again, we must collect everything on everyone all the time.
Okay, here is where I have to interject and push back hard on that specific logic, because it drives me crazy from a purely analytical standpoint.
Sure.
The intelligence community constantly relies on this needle in the haystack defense. They say, well, we need the haystack to find the needle.
Right, you hear that constantly.
But let's just look at the math of that for a second. If the intelligence agencies already missed the 9/11 hijackers, who were the literal needles in this scenario, when the haystack of data was relatively small and targeted, why on earth was their solution to make the haystack infinitely larger?
Right, by collecting the private data of every single innocent American citizen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you are already struggling to find a needle, burying it under a billion more straws of hay doesn't make your job easier. It makes it mathematically impossible. You're just blinding yourself with noise.
Your intuition is spot on there, and it points to the fatal operational flaw in the NSA's entire post-9/11 strategy. This isn't just a legal critique we're making. It's a fundamental intelligence critique.
It just doesn't make sense.
And Drake, speaking from decades of experience as a frontline intelligence analyst, confirms this exactly. By indiscriminately sweeping up massive, just unfathomable volumes of domestic data, they were actually making the analyst's job infinitely harder.
Because they're drowning in data.
Exactly. Think about the human element. When you design a system that regards every single piece of data as a potential threat vector, every email from a grandmother in Ohio sharing a recipe, every text between teenagers in Texas, every spam email, you completely overwhelm the system.
You dilute the actual actionable threat intelligence with oceans of irrelevant domestic noise.
Yeah.
It's the definition of a self-defeating strategy.
Which leads us into one of the most maddening, pull-your-hair-out revelations in this entire deep dive.
Yeah, this car is wild.
Because your pushback about making the haystack bigger wasn't just some hypothetical armchair critique. It turns out the NSA actually already had a solution to this exact problem.
They already had it.
They had a technological program that protected privacy, kept the haystack incredibly small and manageable, and solved the intelligence gap. And they intentionally killed it.
This is the story of Thin Thread, right?
Yes, the tragic story of Thin Thread. In the late 1990s, recognizing the incoming tsunami of the digital age and the explosion of early internet traffic, a group of brilliant engineers, mathematicians, and analysts at the NSA saw the writing on the wall.
They knew they needed a way to parse through vast amounts of digital data, fiber optic traffic, packet switching, without violating FISA or the Fourth Amendment.
Right, so they developed a breakthrough program from scratch.
Okay, I really want to understand the mechanics of this. How did Thin Thread actually work under the hood? Because the concept of scanning mass data while simultaneously preserving constitutional privacy, I mean, it sounds almost like magic to a lot of people today. How do you look at the data without looking at the data?
It was an incredibly elegant piece of software engineering, deeply ahead of its time. Thin Thread was designed to sit on the data streams and observe the metadata.
So routing information, the time, file size, who was contacting whom.
Exactly. The envelope, not the letter. But here's the magic. It was hard-coded to automatically and instantaneously encrypt any content or data point that was recognized as actual or probable U.S. person information.
Whoa. So it anonymized the domestic data at the exact point of collection.
Yes. So an NSA analyst sitting at a terminal couldn't read your emails, they couldn't see your identity, and they couldn't map your social network. The screen would essentially just show encrypted gibberish for any domestic data.
So it's filtering out the noise automatically. But wait, what happens if a U.S. person is actually talking to a foreign terrorist? How does it catch the bad guys if it's encrypting all the domestic stuff?
That was the genius of the system. It utilized sophisticated graphing and metadata analysis. If the system detected a behavioral pattern or a communication node that linked a previously encrypted anonymous U.S. person to a known targeted foreign threat.
And say, like a suspected al-Qaeda safe house overseas.
Exactly. If it saw that connection, Thin Thread would flag it. It allowed for what they called a hot pursuit option.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the mechanics of that. A hot pursuit option, meaning they could then unmask the person. But how does that not violate the Fourth Amendment?
Because the unmasking required a legal step.
Oh, a warrant?
Yes.
Yep.
If the metadata flagged a highly suspicious connection, the NSA could take that encrypted flag, along with the algorithmic proof of probable cause, and go directly to the secret foreign intelligence surveillance court.
They would present the evidence to a judge and obtain a specific lawful warrant to decrypt that one particular thread of communication.
It perfectly balanced the vital need for robust, fast-moving foreign intelligence gathering with absolute mathematically enforced fidelity to the constitutional rights of U.S. citizens. It was the silver bullet.
It sounds perfect. I mean, they had a program that was ready to go, tested in the field, cost-effective, and fully Fourth Amendment compliant. It solved the exact problem they claimed they couldn't solve before 9/11. Why in the world wasn't this deployed to protect the country?
Because, according to Thomas Drake and the other whistleblowers who worked on the project, Thin Thread was cheap, efficient, and most importantly, it did not feed the beast.
The beast being the military-industrial complex.
Exactly. It was shut down prior to 9/11 because NSA leadership wanted to spend massive, astronomical amounts of money on other, vastly more expensive and legally unrestricted programs.
They wanted to build an empire.
A sprawling, multi-billion-dollar empire of contractors. Thin Thread solved the problem too neatly. It didn't require a massive expansion of the budget. It didn't justify building massive new data centers or hiring thousands of private contractors at exorbitant rates.
Drake uses a brilliant analogy in the source material to explain the fundamental difference between the post-9/11 mass surveillance approach they chose and what Thin Thread would have done. I want everyone listening to visualize this.
It's a great analogy, yeah.
Imagine you are trying to find a specific, dangerous piece of contraband hidden somewhere on a massive beach. The mass surveillance approach, the one the government actually went with, is to bring in heavy machinery. You bring in fleets of massive dump trucks.
Right, and you take all the sand off the beach, every single grain.
You haul it hundreds of miles away.
Yeah.
You run it through a massive, multi-billion-dollar industrial filtration system to figure out what you have. But in the process of doing that, you have completely destroyed the beach.
You've ruined the ecosystem entirely.
Exactly. You've removed the sand from its source,
Yeah.
and by the time you filter it, you don't even know where on the beach the contraband originally washed up. You've created an environmental disaster just to find a needle.
It is a devastating analogy for indiscriminate mass collection because it highlights not just the illegality, but the sheer destructive inefficiency of the method.
And thin thread, by contrast, is like simply observing the sand in place. You leave the beach intact.
You respect the ecosystem.
Right. You use sensors to only flag and interact with the foreign elements that wash ashore, leaving the vast majority of the sand completely undisturbed. The beach remains a beach.
When you scale that analogy up and connect it to the broader geopolitical picture, you see a terrifying, perverse incentive taking hold in the digital age.
All of the money. Right.
Always. For the bureaucratic leadership and the private defense contractors, it became infinitely easier, vastly more profitable, and politically expedient to simply suck the ocean dry rather than do the hard, targeted, constitutional work of traditional intelligence gathering.
And to justify this, they engaged in a breathtaking legal distortion.
Oh, the legal gymnastics were unbelievable. They removed the burden of having to determine whether they were violating a citizen's rights by arguing that the mere collection of the data did not constitute a search under the Fourth Amendment.
Wait, really? That was their argument?
Yeah. They claimed that until a human analyst actually sat at a screen and looked at your specific email, your rights hadn't been violated.
Which is an insane interpretation of the law. I mean, the government breaks into my house, takes all my filing cabinets, locks them in a warehouse, and says, don't worry, we haven't opened the folders yet. They still robbed my house. The seizure already happened.
Exactly the point Drake and his colleagues were making. The seizure is the violation. But the government built a legal fiction to justify the massive contracts and the unprecedented expansion of power.
So we have this toxic environment inside the NSA. The Constitution is being secretly subverted on a daily basis. A working legal alternative was intentionally killed for profit and bureaucratic power. And Thomas Drake is sitting there in his senior executive chair with his oath to support and defend the Constitution ringing in his ears.
It's a huge burden.
What does an insider do when they realize their own government at the highest levels has gone rogue? We're always told by politicians and pundits, if you see something wrong, don't leak it to the press. Go through the proper channels. Trust the system.
And that is exactly what Thomas Drake attempted to do, to his immense detriment. His story is a harrowing, step-by-step descent into the nightmare of what actually happens when a whistleblower plays by the rules and trusts the system.
It really is a nightmare.
It's vital to understand that he didn't just walk out of the building and hand classified documents to a reporter on day one. He exhausted every single internal mechanism available to a federal employee.
Let's run down the timeline of his whistleblowing, because the persistence is staggering. First, as we mentioned, he confronted his direct superiors and the NSA General Counsel.
Right, and when he was stonewalled there, he became a material witness and blew the whistle to two separate congressional investigations looking into the 9/11 intelligence failures.
He went to Congress, and then he went to the Department of Defense Inspector General, which is the internal watchdog designed specifically to handle these types of complaints.
He even blew the whistle directly to the director of the NSA, Keith Alexander, in 2005.
Yeah.
He testified in a SCIF.
Okay, for those who might not know, a SCI is a sensitive compartmented information facility. It is a secure, bug-proof room used for discussing the highest levels of classified information.
Right, it's as secure as it gets.
So by testifying there, he was providing highly classified, irrefutable evidence of blanket surveillance equipment being placed on U.S. domestic networks to cleared congressional investigators, assuming that the law would protect him.
But as Drake points out with bitter clarity, having whistleblower rights written on a piece of paper is completely meaningless if there is no enforcement mechanism when those rights are violated.
The system protects itself.
Always. The internal channels he used were not independent. They were monitored, influenced, and ultimately controlled by the very secret powers he was exposing. The administration had two primary objectives: cover up the massive intelligence failures that led to 9/11, and cover up the illegal domestic surveillance program they built in its wake.
And Drake was threatening both of those objectives simultaneously.
Exactly. And then the timeline accelerates dramatically.
In December 2005, The New York Times drops a bombshell. They publish a massive front-page article by journalists James Risen and Eric Lichtblau, revealing the existence of the warrantless wiretapping program to the American public for the very first time.
It was huge news.
Huge! Now, Drake explicitly notes in our source material that he had absolutely not gone to the press at this point.
Right, he was completely focused on the internal legal whistleblower channels. He wasn't the source for the Times article.
But the government was panicking. They needed a scapegoat. They needed a narrative to launch a massive, chilling leak investigation to terrify anyone else from coming forward. So they effectively framed Thomas Drake as the primary suspect.
It was a classic, brutal, knee-jerk reaction by the executive branch. When a scandal breaks, they assume leaks come from internal dissidents or Congress, and they weaponize the justice system to crush them.
And Drake knew he was a marked man because he had been so relentlessly vocal internally.
Right. He was viewed as a dangerous threat because he couldn't be bought and he couldn't be controlled. The retaliation was methodical.
First, he lost his job responsibilities. He was laterally moved into meaningless bureaucratic roles, isolated from his colleagues.
Eventually, frustrated by the total failure of the oversight committees, he did make the fateful decision to contact a reporter anonymously. Though he stresses repeatedly in the interview that he only shared unclassified information about waste, fraud, and the existence of the thin thread alternative.
He never shared classified surveillance operational detail.
Never. But the nuance didn't matter to the government. The hammer falls anyway.
In November 2007, the FBI raids his home.
Yeah.
He describes it in the interview as the day he will remember for the rest of his life. A man's home is supposed to be his castle. It is the final defense against government intrusion, the very core of the Fourth Amendment he was trying to protect. And suddenly, armed federal agents are tearing through his belongings, seizing his computers, his notes, his entire life.
Fast forward through years of legal limbo, and in April 2010, Thomas Drake is unceremoniously indicted under the Espionage Act.
He was facing 35 years in a federal penitentiary.
Think about the weight of that. 35 years. For attempting to uphold the law of the land.
Under the Espionage Act.
Right. The Espionage Act was written during World War I to prosecute actual spies selling secrets to foreign enemies. The government twisted it to paint a decorated veteran and truth-teller as an enemy of the state.
He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on his defense, burning through his life savings. He endured immense psychological and physical strain. He was fully preparing to say goodbye to his family and spend the rest of his natural life behind bars.
And then, on the absolute eve of the trial, after dragging him through this 14-month public nightmare and destroying his reputation, the government's entire case collapsed like a house of cards.
Because they didn't actually have the evidence to support an espionage charge, and they didn't want to expose their own illegal programs in open court.
Exactly. They dropped all the major felony charges. He ultimately pleads out to a minor misdemeanor exceeding authorized use of a government computer.
It's essentially the equivalent of a digital parking ticket, a charge that involved absolutely zero classified information.
But the government achieved its goal regardless.
The process is the punishment.
Exactly. He lost a multi-million-dollar pension because he was just a few years shy of full retirement. His career was destroyed. He ended up working in an Apple retail store just to make ends meet.
Which is just heartbreaking.
It is. And this entire saga raises an incredibly important, world-changing historical connection. This ordeal was watched very, very closely by a young intelligence contractor working in the system at the time, a man named Edward Snowden.
That is the part of the interview that gave me absolute chills. Snowden is quoted in the source material as saying, "There would be no Edward Snowden without Thomas Drake."
It fundamentally shifts how you view the last 20 years of history, doesn't it?
It really does. It is a profound, direct lineage. Snowden watched Drake try to do everything right. He saw Drake go to the Inspector General. He saw him go to Congress. He saw him go to his superiors.
And he saw the government retaliate by trying to lock him in a cage for 35 years and completely destroy his life.
So Snowden realized, logically, that going through the proper channels to expose a secret, illegal mass surveillance apparatus only gets you annihilated by the secret powers running it.
The system will never voluntarily indict itself. So in 2013, Snowden decided to take a completely different route, bypassing the internal channels entirely, taking the documents, and going directly to the global public.
You really have to stop and highlight Drake's fierce loyalty to his oath here. He took an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Not an oath to a three-letter agency.
Exactly. Not an oath to a sitting president, but to the legal bedrock of the country. I want you, the listener, to really imagine that scenario. Imagine facing 35 years in a federal penitentiary, losing your life savings, having your name dragged through the mud on national television, losing your freedom, simply because you asked the government to obey its own laws. It is terrifying.
It is terrifying. And what makes it even more relevant to our daily lives right now is that Drake's battle in the early 2000s was primarily over phone records, text messages, and early internet emails. It was the dawn of the digital age.
Right? Flip phones and dial-up, basically.
Yeah. But the surveillance state didn't shrink after his whistleblowing, or even after Snowden's massive disclosures in 2013. Instead, it metamorphosed. It adapted to the legal challenges.
How so?
Well, the government realized that building and maintaining its own massive physical collection infrastructure was politically risky and legally cumbersome. So it effectively outsourced the surveillance to Silicon Valley and to local municipalities.
Which brings us fast forward to today, the commoditization and weaponization of our personal data. How exactly is this happening now if the NSA isn't physically tapping the fiber optic wires as aggressively as they used to? How do they get the data?
The central legal pillar of the modern surveillance state relies on a judicial concept called the third-party doctrine.
The third-party doctrine.
Right. It is a legal loophole originally established decades ago regarding physical bank records and phone numbers dialed, but it has been stretched to cover our entire digital lives. It essentially argues that if you voluntarily share your data with a third party like a telecommunications company, a smartphone app developer, or a social media platform, you no longer have a reasonable expectation of privacy regarding that data.
So the implication there is that because I mindlessly click accept on a 50-page terms and conditions document to use a free weather app, the location data I generate isn't mine anymore.
Precisely the opposite of ownership. You don't own your digital footprint. It belongs to the corporation.
And because it legally belongs to the corporation.
The government doesn't need to go to a judge, demonstrate probable cause, and get a Fourth Amendment warrant to look at your specific data. They can simply bypass the judicial system entirely.
That is a massive loophole.
It's created a massive, unregulated shadow economy that Drake refers to as the data broker loophole. Federal agencies like ICE, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the DoD now routinely bypass warrant requirements by simply taking taxpayer money and purchasing massive aggregated data sets directly from commercial data brokers.
I'm trying to wrap my head around how you actually buy this data. If I'm a federal agency, I don't just go to Amazon and put citizen location data in my shopping cart, right? How does this marketplace actually function?
It is a highly lucrative, sophisticated secondary market. Data brokers scrape data from thousands of disparate sources, the weather app tracking your GPS, the retail loyalty card tracking your purchases, the social media site tracking your network, your car's navigation system.
They just pull it all together?
Yeah, they aggregate all these separate streams, correlate them to build incredibly detailed profiles of individual citizens, and then sell access to these databases. Law enforcement agencies simply buy a subscription.
A subscription?
Yeah. They use a corporate portal to query your location history, your communication metadata, and your browsing habits, all without ever stepping foot inside a courtroom.
They're just buying our lives on the open market. And it's not just the phones in our pockets. The source text goes into deep detail about something called FLARC cameras.
These are everywhere now.
Yeah. Now, when I hear traffic cameras, I think of the red light cameras we grew up with that just snap a grainy picture if you speed through an intersection. But these are entirely different. There are tens of thousands of these flock cameras blanketing U.S. cities and suburbs right now. The text notes there are actual maps showing just how pervasive and localized they are. And they do way more than take a picture of your license plate.
This is where the technological integration becomes truly dystopian, moving from simple optics to full-spectrum environmental surveillance. These cameras and their associated surveillance nodes are picking up electronic signatures from the environment in real time.
So they aren't just taking photos.
No. Yes, they use automated license plate readers, or ALPR, to capture your physical plate. But simultaneously, they are equipped with RF scanners. They are detecting the unique Bluetooth MSC addresses constantly broadcasting from your smartphone, your smartwatch, or your wireless headphones.
Wow.
They are interfacing with the telematics and transponders built into electric vehicles and modern cars.
So they are cross-referencing physical optics with invisible digital signals.
I try to think about the illusion of control we have over our tech. We think, oh, I'll just be smart about it. I'll turn off Bluetooth on my phone, or I'll use a browser that rejects cookies. But the architecture is designed to defeat that.
It is.
Drake talks about having an EV, an electric vehicle, and physically trying to turn off or disconnect the internal communications module to stop it from phoning home. But the moment he drives down his local street, a flock camera links his physical license plate to the electronic signature of his phone and his vehicle's onboard diagnostic systems. The device itself is inherently a tracking beacon, and the environment is designed to read it. It is an inescapable, interwoven net. And all of this disparate data, your physical location captured by cameras, your digital purchases captured by brokers, your social connections mapped by platforms, is being aggregated, correlated, and stored in massive government repositories.
Like the Utah data center.
Exactly. The text mentions the NSA's Utah data center, which is a multi-billion-dollar, heavily fortified facility built specifically to store an unimaginable, virtually infinite amount of data permanently. They are building a permanent historical record of the population.
It reminds me of the movie The Dark Knight Rises, which actually gets brought up in the interview.
Oh, that's right, the clean slate.
Yeah. Anne Hathaway's character, Selena Kyle, is desperately searching the criminal underworld for this mythical software program called the Clean Slate. The idea is that this program can hack into every global database on Earth and completely wipe your criminal record, your digital footprint, giving you a fresh start.
And the tragic joke of the movie is that the clean slate is a myth.
It doesn't exist. Once your data is digitized, aggregated, and commoditized across thousands of servers, it is permanent. You can never truly wipe your footprint.
That cinematic metaphor perfectly encapsulates our current reality. We have transitioned from buying software or media to merely renting licenses, trading our deeply personal data for minor, everyday conveniences, completely unaware that this permanent digital record is being weaponized against us.
That actually reframes the whole issue. Let's talk about that weaponization. Because having established how they collect the data, we must look at why they are collecting it and how it is used against citizens.
Right, surveillance isn't passive anymore.
No, surveillance isn't just about passively watching us to see if we do something wrong. It's about actively shaping behavior, controlling the population, and predicting future actions.
Once a state or a corporate state alliance has a permanent, endlessly searchable database of a population's behavior, they inevitably move towards systems of algorithmic discrimination and predictive surveillance.
Like pre-crime stuff.
Exactly. The source material highlights the terrifying reality of secret watch lists. People end up on these lists through opaque algorithmic flagging with zero recourse, no notification, and absolutely no legal mechanism to challenge their inclusion or face their accuser.
And it isn't just anonymous people or suspected criminals. The text explicitly points out that high-profile, globally recognized figures have found themselves caught in this dragnet.
Right, the politicians.
Yeah, former Senator Ted Kennedy, one of those famous politicians in American history, sitting on powerful Senate committees, was flagged on a terror watch list and stopped at airports. Former Representative Tulsi Gabbard was placed on a watch list. It shows that absolutely nobody is immune from the system, regardless of their status, their political affiliation, or their level of public visibility.
And if high-profile politicians can be caught in the algorithmic crosshairs, imagine the vulnerability of an average citizen. You might never know you're on a secret list until your entire life is suddenly upended.
Which brings us to debanking.
Right. The source discusses this modern phenomenon of debanking, which is effectively the modern digital equivalent of medieval excommunication.
It's brutal.
The text cites specific instances of journalists and everyday citizens having their bank accounts frozen or shut down entirely due to their political speech, specifically mentioning independent coverage that dissented from the mainstream narrative on the Ukraine war.
Think about what that actually means mechanically in a cashless society. If you cannot hold a bank account, you cannot receive a direct deposit from your employer, you cannot pay your mortgage or rent, you cannot buy groceries with a debit card, you cannot pay for a flight.
You're paralyzed.
Completely.
Yeah.
If the state or the massive financial corporations acting in tandem with the state decide they don't like what you said on social media, they don't have to send police to your door to arrest you. They just turn off your ability to engage in commerce. You are banished from society. You are digitally starved out.
And the legislative attempts to deepen this level of control are ongoing as we speak. The text mentions proposed legislation like the KIDDI Act, or KOSA, which stands for the Kids Online Safety Act.
Oh, this one is sneaky.
It is. This is legislation pushed under the universally appealing, politically bulletproof guise of protecting children. But if you look at the practical and mechanical requirements of the law, it would force internet users to prove their physical, state-issued identity to log onto platforms and interact online.
Which utterly destroys the fundamental concept of digital anonymity. If you have to scan your driver's license or provide a biometric scan to use the internet, how does a whistleblower ever contact a journalist?
They can't.
You can't just meet in a dark parking garage like Deep Throat did during Watergate anymore because the flock cameras track your EV routing, your phone's Bluetooth pings the garage sensors, and facial recognition logs your presence the moment you step out of the car. If you destroy digital anonymity, you destroy investigative journalism, you destroy the ability to organize political opposition, and you destroy the right to dissent.
This brings us to a chilling quote from Stalin's secret police chief, Lavrent Beria, that Drake invokes in the interview. It perfectly encapsulates the danger of a permanent data record. Show me the man, and I'll show you the crime.
Wow. Show me the man, and I'll show you the crime.
Yes. When the state has a permanent searchable record of every text you've ever sent, every location you've ever visited, every purchase you've ever made, and every digital interaction you have ever engaged in, they don't need to catch you in the act of committing a crime.
Because they can just dig until they find one.
Exactly. If you become a political nuisance, they can target you, mine your entire life's data using AI algorithms, and retroactively manufacture a crime or a regulatory violation out of the noise. Everyone has broken some obscure law or terms of service at some point.
It creates a society built entirely on fear and anticipation of punishment.
Right.
What is the psychological implication of that? Because it feels like if you know you're constantly being watched, or even just suspect you might be watched, you fundamentally change how you act.
The term for that is the chilling effect. It is a well-documented, powerful psychological phenomenon, historically linked to the concept of the panopticon.
The prison design.
Right. The panopticon was a prison design where the inmates could be watched by a single guard in a central tower, but the inmates couldn't see into the tower. Because they never knew exactly when they were being watched, they had to assume they were being watched all the time.
So they started behaving perfectly just in case.
Exactly. They began to police their own behavior. In our modern digital panopticon, when human beings know they're under constant surveillance, they instinctively self-censor. They avoid reading controversial topics, they limit their associations, they suppress their own thoughts.
The surveillance doesn't even have to be actively weaponized against them to be effective.
The mere presence of the infrastructure forces the population to internalize the control. Fear replaces liberty as the primary mechanism of governance.
This leads us directly into the philosophical core of this entire deep dive. If our speech is monitored and logged, if our money can be turned off with a keystroke, if our physical movements are tracked by cameras and Bluetooth beacons, what happens to our inner life? This feels like the ultimate stakes of the conversation, beyond just the legal arguments.
The source material ventures into profound, almost existential territory here, mentioning claims from CIA whistleblowers that the ultimate long-term goal of the intelligence apparatus is not just tracking physical movement or intercepting emails, but literally mapping human consciousness itself.
Mapping consciousness, that is incredibly dark.
It is the desire to understand, predict, and ultimately merge AI analytical capabilities with human behavioral patterns to achieve total, frictionless control over the population.
Drake talks passionately about the loss of the sacred space. The Founding Fathers, when they conceptualized and wrote the Constitution, intended for human beings to have an inner life, a conscience, a private domestic domain completely free from state intrusion. Your home, your papers, your thoughts were yours alone.
And this is exactly why Drake argues that the Fourth Amendment is, in reality, the absolute bedrock of the First Amendment.
We always think of the First Amendment as the big one.
We do. We think of free speech as the most important right, the pinnacle of liberty. But if you do not have privacy, if the government can search your digital papers, your physical life, your associations, and your financial transactions at will, then you cannot effectively exercise free speech.
But can't.
You cannot have freedom of association. You cannot organize a political opposition, run a dissenting campaign, or voice an unpopular opinion if the state is reading the organizational emails in real time and mapping the network of supporters. Privacy is the absolute prerequisite for liberty. Without it, the other rights are just illusions on paper.
Which makes me want to ask a question drawn directly from the text, something I want everyone listening to really chew on while they look at their devices today. Are we sleepwalking into a society where privacy disappears entirely before a new generation even understands what the word originally meant? Will kids growing up today, surrounded by flock cameras, predictive algorithms, and mandatory digital IDs, even be able to conceptualize the idea of a sacred space?
It is a tragic, looming possibility. Drake describes this trajectory of total surveillance as fundamentally anti-life and anti-human.
Anti-human.
It attacks the very core of human agency and free will, and to understand why the apparatus refuses to stop, we have to look at the intoxicating nature of power. Drake references Henry Kissinger's famous, cynical quote, "Power is the greatest aphrodisiac."
Meaning that once a government, a bureaucracy, or an intelligence agency gets a taste of this kind of omniscient, godlike control, they are hooked. They will never let it go.
The historical record shows they will never voluntarily surrender the tools of turnkey tyranny. The seduction of being able to monitor, predict, and control a population is simply too great for any centralized authority to resist. They will always find a new justification, whether it's national security, public safety, a health crisis, or protecting the children to maintain, upgrade, and aggressively expand the surveillance apparatus.
Okay, we need to take a deep breath because this has been an incredibly heavy, dense journey through some dark aspects of our modern reality. Let's recap exactly where we've been.
Good idea.
We started by looking back at the analog protections of the 1970s, an era where the law strictly guarded the rights of the individual against the state, born out of the painful lessons of the Church Committee. We saw how the immense trauma and systemic failure of 9/11 was immediately used as a justification to blast through those constitutional guardrails, replacing targeted legal intelligence gathering with indiscriminate illegal mass collection.
We spent time examining the tragedy of Thin Thread, the path not taken, a brilliant technological solution that protected privacy, maintained the ecosystem of civil liberties, and targeted real threats, but was discarded in favor of expanding the bloated, highly profitable military-industrial complex.
We followed Thomas Drake's harrowing descent through the so-called proper channels, resulting in a ruined career, an FBI raid, the threat of 35 years in a federal prison under the Espionage Act.
And the chilling realization by Edward Snowden that the system cannot and will not be reformed from within.
And we brought it all the way forward to the present day, where the NSA's physical wiretaps have been largely replaced by the legal fiction of the third-party doctrine, the shadow economy of data brokers, the ubiquitous net of flock cameras, algorithmic watch lists, and the very real, very modern threat of being debanked and digitally excommunicated from society for exercising your political speech.
The inescapable daily reality is that every time you drive past a traffic camera at an intersection, every time you use a tap-to-pay terminal at a coffee shop, every time you blindly click agree to a digital terms of service update, you are interacting with the living ghosts of the post-9/11 surveillance apparatus that Thomas Drake sacrificed his livelihood to warn the world about.
And to close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought that really stuck with me. It's a very personal, poignant story Thomas Drake tells at the very end of the source material about his childhood. He recalls growing up and, as a little kid, making an innocent but foolish mistake. He climbed a neighbor's fence and stole a prized, beautiful rosebud from their yard because he wanted to give it to his mom.
It is a quintessential, universal story of childhood innocence, impulse, and just minor transgression.
Right. And what happened next? The neighbor realized the flower was gone, figured it out, and knocked on his family's door. They had a face-to-face conversation. The young Thomas got in trouble, he apologized, he learned a valuable lesson about respecting private property, and that was it.
It was resolved locally, gracefully, and it was left entirely in the past.
Exactly. It wasn't recorded in a database. It wasn't attached to a permanent digital profile that would somehow flag a background check or follow him to a job interview 20 years later.
It speaks to the vital, deeply human need for grace. The ability to be young, to make a mistake, to learn from it, and most importantly, to have that mistake forgotten by the community so you can grow.
So I want you to ponder this as you go about your day, with that incredible computer sitting in your pocket tracking your steps. In a world of permanent digital records, flock cameras logging our every movement, AI behavioral profiling analyzing our every keystroke, and data brokers selling our histories, what happens to the human right to make a mistake and be forgiven? If society, aided by the cold, permanent memory of the machine, never forgets, can it ever truly forgive? We have permanently lost the clean slate. What does that do to the human soul?
That is a defining question of our age and one we are currently failing to answer.
Think about it.